calculating aircraft performance, as you know, can be a labor of love. Do you have any suggestions on how you can streamline the process?
It's not a labor of love. I don't like to compute aircraft performance, but it's necessary.
Yeah.
It's something you have to do. I like to make little abbreviated cheat sheets for myself with respect to a given airplane. I produce a little cheat sheet, a little card, and I'll write down the airspeed I expect to get at different altitudes under average conditions. So I may have only 6 or 8 such airspeeds to reference. And I find they're close enough. When you're taking an FAA exam, it's a little bit different, of course. You have to use a pencil that's really, really sharp, and you have to use the performance charts right down to the gnat's eyebrow.
Let's take a closer look at winds and runways. First, you need to understand that the wind is always reported in the direction from which it's blowing. For example, a wind reported as 090 degrees at 10 is blowing from 90 degrees from the east at 10 knots. Second, surface winds reported over the radio by the tower, an ATIS, or an automated system are referenced to magnetic headings, which is handy since runways are also aligned with magnetic headings. But winds in text weather reports are referenced to true north. Now, assume we're lined up on runway 18. If we put a compass rose around the runway, we can visualize the crosswinds coming from different directions. If the wind is blowing from 270 degrees, it's at a 90-degree angle to the runway. In other words, it's a direct crosswind, regardless of whether you use runway 18 or 36. Now assume the wind is coming from the southwest, or 220 degrees. We have a quartering headwind from the right. Whenever possible, we want to take off into the wind, so with this wind, we choose runway 18. However, if the wind were blowing out of the south, 180 degrees, obviously the best choice is runway 18. The POH for your airplane includes a graph that you can use to determine headwind and crosswind components for any runway. Headwind and crosswind components are labeled on the horizontal and vertical axis. The lines radiating from the bottom of the graph mark the angle difference between the wind and the runway heading from 0 to 90 degrees, and the arcs represent the wind velocity in knots. Now, the crosswind component table includes an example that shows you how to use it. If the wind's blowing at a 30-degree angle to the runway at 40 knots, we start up here at point A along the 30-degree line and move down until we intersect the 40-knot arc. To determine the headwind component, move directly across to point C on the headwind component scale and read 35 knots. Now, to determine the crosswind component, go back to point B, the intersection of the angle and the wind velocity, and drop straight down to the crosswind component and read 20 knots.
Now, how do you go about setting personal minimums on things like crosswinds in an airplane you've never flown before?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. Well, the first thing I like to do is, before I even undertake a crosswind, before I would even think about flying a new airplane under crosswind conditions, is to see how well the roll response is. See how well I can handle a gust-induced roll one way or the other. I like to see, for example, how much rudder action I have. So I like to take an airplane in the air and put it into slips one way and then the other, as if I were simulating landing in a crosswind. And by doing that, I'll have some sense of just how strong a crosswind I can overcome. But it's also how well and how quickly the airplane responds to those control inputs that becomes very important. So if I wanted to determine how much crosswind I thought it could take, I'd have to do some flight testing first. And that involves simulating the crosswind by making some forward slips up in the air. See if that rudder is effective, see if the roll control is crisp or if it's dull.